Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the story of a guy whose impact is honestly as profound as any world leader you can name. But it's also a story filled with some incredibly dark, complicated contradictions. We're talking, of course, about Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company. You know, on one hand, his innovations completely revolutionized human industry and personal transportation. But on the other hand, his personal convictions cast this long, deeply troubling shadow over that exact same legacy.
15 million. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of Model T automobiles sold over just 19 years. It literally changed the world. But it forces us to ask a really tough question. How could the man who single-handedly revolutionized industry, the guy who put the masses behind the wheel, also harbor such deeply toxic ideologies? Well, to make sense of this whole paradox, we've got to go back to the very beginning. Let's dive in.
Section 1. The mechanic meets the motor.
So young Henry Ford was born to Irish immigrants who had actually fled the devastating potato famine. And growing up, he developed this keen, almost obsessive interest in mechanics. By 1879, teenage Ford packed up and moved to a rapidly growing Detroit as an apprentice machinist. Throughout the 1880s, he got really good at repairing Westinghouse farm engines. But here's where it gets super fascinating. In 1891, he started a stint with the Edison Illuminating Company. Yeah, that Edison. He was a chief engineer working directly for Thomas Edison's operation. During his off hours, he'd be tinkering away with petroleum-fueled engines. And this culminated in 1896 with the Ford quadricycle. Picture this, essentially a two-seat bench bolted onto a frame with 4 bicycle wheels. It was primitive, sure, but it was a start. After a few rocky business ventures, mostly because his extreme perfectionism clashed with his financial backers, he finally founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903.
You know, founding a company and actually keeping it afloat? Totally different ballgames. Ford desperately needed major financial backing, and he went out and secured it in the most dramatic way imaginable. In January 1904, he took a prototype called the Ford 999 Racer out onto the frozen ice of Lake St. Clair, and he set a staggering land speed record that day, topping 90 miles per hour. Just incredible. Having publicly proven his absolute brilliance when it came to engineering and speed, well, investor money just started pouring in. He finally had the stable footing he needed.
Section 2. Cracking mass production code.
Okay, fast forward to 1908. Ford launches his 20th design, the legendary Model T. But he didn't just invent a great car here. He completely cracked the code of mass production. This is where his true genius shines through, a concept known as Fordism. Instead of having one highly skilled craftsman build an entire car from scratch, start to finish, Ford introduced continuous assembly lines. Every single worker was trained to perform just one repetitive manufacturing task as the vehicle moved steadily down the line. It was a total paradigm shift. I mean, it completely transformed global industry overnight. And the sheer impact of that assembly line on efficiency, absolutely unprecedented. To put this into perspective, when the Model T launched in 1908, it took 12 hours to produce just one car, and it cost $825. By the 1920s, thanks to Fordism, that production time plummeted to just 93 minutes. 93 minutes! And the price dropped to around $300. These plunging production times made the automobile actually affordable for the rapidly expanding middle class, completely changing personal travel forever.
Naturally, sales just exploded. In 1913, they sold over 100,000 cars. By 1916, 500,000. And by the mid-1920s, they were pushing out over 2 million Model Ts every single year. That stratospheric scale required tens of thousands of factory workers, which single-handedly swelled Detroit's population from around 450,000 in 1910 to 1 million people by 1920. Almost overnight, Michigan became the undisputed automotive capital of the world.
Moving on to Section 3. Utopias and aviation failures. Now, as you might guess, this kind of unprecedented stratospheric success bred a certain level of hubris in Henry Ford. He actually started to believe his methods could instantly revolutionize any industry he touched. First up was his premature leap into commercial aviation. In 1924, he set up the Stout Metal Airplane Company, and by 1926 introduced the Ford Trimotor airplane, which people affectionately nicknamed the Tin Goose. It was designed to carry a dozen commercial passengers. His vision? To kick off mass commercial airline flights between American cities. But the harsh reality was that he was simply way too far ahead of his time. The technology and the infrastructure just wouldn't truly catch up to his commercial airline vision until after the Second World War.
But even more bizarre than the airplane was his 1928 utopian experiment to secure cheap rubber. He actually went and built an entire model industrial town smack in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon. He called it Fordlandia. Ford adopted this excessively parental attitude, subjecting local workers to these strict dietary regulations and placing an absolute ban on alcohol and tobacco. It was, frankly, an absolute disaster of micromanagement. The workers eventually had enough and staged an open revolt, cutting telegraph lines, and relations deteriorated so badly that the Brazilian army literally had to intervene. By 1934, this massive jungle investment was completely abandoned.
Section 4. A dark political shadow.
It is absolutely vital that we impartially examine the darkest chapter of his legacy. In 1918, Ford purchased a newspaper in his native Dearborn called the Dearborn Independent, and he quickly transformed it into an outlet for his own anti-Semitic sentiments. The newspaper began publishing headlines like The Economic Plan of International Jews and Jewish Power and America's Money Famine. Ford used his massive wealth and clout to turn this paper into one of America's best-selling publications. He was directly platforming and spreading rampant anti-Semitic tropes of the era regarding global finance and world politics right into the mainstream public sphere. Furthermore, these very articles were compiled into a 4-volume set, published as a book titled The International Jew. This work was then translated and published widely across Europe in the years leading up to the Holocaust. Because of these specific publications, Ford actually became a highly admired figure within Nazi Germany. Now, this ideology ties directly into his incredibly contradictory political stance during the onset of the Second World War. On one hand, Ford was a staunch isolationist. He aggressively campaigned to keep the United States out of the European conflict, becoming the most influential member of the America First Committee alongside figures like Charles Lindbergh. Yet, paradoxically, his company had previously provided technical advice to Soviet factories, who were the mortal enemies of Nazi Germany. And then once the U.S. actually entered the war following Pearl Harbor, Ford completely pivoted. He repurposed his vast factories to produce hundreds of thousands of planes and military vehicles, most notably the massive B-24 Liberator bombers for the U.S. military. It is just a very strange paradox of a man attempting to keep America out of the war while simultaneously fueling massive global military production.
Section 5. Decline, Tragedy, and Rebirth. The final act of Ford's life is really defined by a massive internal clash with his only child, Edsel Ford. You see, Henry had kind of become a victim of his own success. He truly believed the stratospheric triumph of the Model T meant his traditional approach would just work forever. Edsel, however, clearly saw that competitors like Chrysler and General Motors were innovating right past them. Edsel was constantly pushing for modern features, things like V8 engines, the updated Model B, and high-end luxury sports cars like the Lincoln Zephyr. But Henry's stubborn refusal to adapt and his constant public undermining of his own son nearly crippled the company's long-term prospects.
And this whole dynamic ended in sheer tragedy. In 1943, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at just 49 years old. A grieving and physically declining Henry, who was nearing 80 at the time and suffering from suspected strokes, attempted to step back in and run the day-to-day operations. It was a disaster. The company quickly fell into dire financial straits. Finally, in 1945, Edsel's son, Henry Ford II, took over as president, and he successfully steered the company back to profitability. Henry Ford Sr. passed away in 1947 at the age of 83. And the company that his grandson saved, it eventually went public in 1956 in what was then the largest initial public offering in U.S. history, securing its rebirth and its future.
Which really just leaves us with this final provocative thought. Genius or villain? Henry Ford's story is entirely paradoxical. I mean, should he be remembered as the brilliant usher of the automobile revolution and the architect of modern mass production? Or is his historical legacy fundamentally compromised by the darkness of his personal convictions and his anti-Semitic campaigns? It's a really complicated, fascinating history to untangle. Take a moment to think about how we weigh the scales of innovation against character. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the world we live in today.